Yeah, you got to be a good trucker, right?
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line of being in this industry. It's easy to, what's that famous phrase, rising tides raise all the ships. Someone on there is going to tell me what the actual quote is, so I'm looking forward to that. But it's when operators succeed in markets like this is when they're a good long-term partner to have in your network. That's just how I view it.
Welcome back to the ThinkFreight Podcast. Thanks for joining us again today. I'm your host, Thomas Wardine. I'm excited to have Jesse Griffin. He's the West Region Sales Manager over at Crete Carrier Corp. Jesse, welcome to the pod, man. I appreciate you taking some time today to join us.
No, thank you, man. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. I'm a bashful person, so I'm going to have a good read until I settle in here a little bit. As always, it's my sales edge always there. I give a little bit too much to care.
Hey, dude, I totally understand. I'll be frank. I used to get the same way. My first probably 10 podcasts, if you go back and watch them, I'd get super nervously read for the first 3 to 5 minutes. And that'd be fine once you settle into it. But man, I really do appreciate your time. We've talked a couple of times offline. You just celebrated a birthday, so I'll tell you on here, happy birthday once more. But aside from just celebrating an awesome birthday, why don't you tell the audience a bit about yourself, who you are, how you got into this crazy world of freight and logistics, and where you've been and what's your full background?
I got to thank my middle sister for getting into this crazy industry. I was in college and I wanted to be a history teacher and a basketball coach. That was kind of my agenda of I'm going to get this done.
You're far from that, man.
It definitely did deviate a ton. But the funny part was she worked for JB Hunt at the time on their dedicated side. And basically they were just kind of on the start of building their brokerage side. And that start might be the wrong word, but the side before it got big. I remember I was JBro815 for all you JB Hunt ICS brokers out there. And so one day she hit me up and she was talking about freight, and the school market wasn't looking good during that recession at the time. Budgets were being cut. And she goes, just give trucking a shot, And so a couple guys out in Irvine, California, starting up a brokerage office out there, gave me a chance as an intern, and it never looked back, man. Now that I think about it, it's always been some kind of reason, like we talked about, it was learning all the trucking. And my first job, one of the guys there gave me his notebook of the carriers that were in it. And he goes, hey, we need to call these guys again. And we need to find out exactly what they do and for how much. And he got to jot it down and give it back to me. And I was sitting there and I was kind of nervous at the time, because I feel like you always want to do something cool when you're starting out in a job, And for some reason, that was not cool, for me. I don't know why. But I look back on it, in hindsight's 2020, that was my first chance in carrier sourcing, talking to new carriers and the brokerage side. And I wrote down this little scratch notebook. I gave it back to him, but that's all I did for 3 or 4 months as an intern, was just call carriers. Eventually started tracking loads, everybody's favorite, got to be proactive. And then they kind of took it on me to find opportunities, which is really cool. That's one thing about JB Hunt that they do really well, is they got a U.S. scope that has plenty of opportunities. So I moved to Washington. From Washington, I basically went and started up with a couple other people, a dedicated account form up there. And I was just in my mid-20s. Who doesn't want to relocate and start something new and go to a cool city like Seattle or Tacoma?
Right.
And it was just easy. It was an easy decision at the time, And I got up there and I fell in love with the state. I just loved it, and I don't want to relocate anymore. I didn't want to move. The next promotion was probably going to be elsewhere out of state or to Arkansas. And there's no knock on either one. I love both of them, But I met my girlfriend at the time, and I had a good feeling for it. Funny story, she's my wife now, with a proud mother of our first child too. So good feeling there. Intuition was on point.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
But the only part was I went and started at a company called Interstate. Maybe we can pour one out after the podcast forum, RIP, but they're now Heartland Express. And that kind of was the kind of pivot for me that kind of started the chain reactions, right? It was, I was looking at opportunities then, because it was either stay there and work there. But my mom had called me out of nowhere. And she basically told me that she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was tough, obviously, because you don't know what to do. And I just knew I had to be down there, and I'd actually taken a job to get not out of transportation, but onto a shipper side of transportation prior in Idaho. And I ended up not accepting it because remote work back then just wasn't a thing,
Right.
And I couldn't forgive myself, man, if I wasn't going to be near my mom while she was battling. Good news
Yeah.
is, took the chance, moved to Arizona, spent about 4 years on the pricing and network side for Night Swift after a good intro from an ex-interstate guy,
Yeah.
and the good news after that was, hey, my mom's in remission. She beat breast cancer for the time being,
Amazing.
which I hope is forever, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
And it just kind of started the home base here. I didn't expect to live in Arizona permanently. But after the 4 years there, it's challenged to go help start FreightVana in Phoenix. And I think part of my ambition there was I loved the people that are working there. Right, they're just honestly some great people.
Yeah.
But I kind of regret not taking a risk to kind of join. It sounds kind of weird to say out loud right now, but Convoy back in the day. When I was up there, I had done
Interesting.
some interviews with some great people there, and I really appreciated their idea at the time. So I kind of look back on that, and I'm like, I'm not going to regret this next time it comes up, right? And it did. And man, there's some really talented people at FreightVana that just absolutely just give me all the experience I've ever needed, in terms of like growth. I've never done sales prior to that, always operations, pricing and network. And, from there, it kind of just opened up my world a little bit. As a startup world can get, not unstable is the wrong word choice, but it can be a little dynamic,
Oh
and with the
yeah.
baby on board, I actually got a warm referral for replacing a guy who's been at Crete for 30 years, man.
Wow.
And so he was managing the West sales out there. And I interviewed the team out there, and I could tell you what, man, it was one of the harder decisions I've ever made because of just, who you've built with and who you've done those things with, right? But
Absolutely.
I love the people almost just as much as I love working at FreightVana. I saw the same culture. I liked that interstate, right? This big company that still somewhat how solves big problems, but they are small enough that you know everybody you're working with, like they're your friends, And I really appreciated that stability, especially welcoming our daughter in January. So it was an opportunity to take a promotion that I was really stoked about. But I look back at it, to your right, the last 15 years have always been just a piecing of decisions that just add up.
Yeah, man. Like every decision you made has led up to exactly where you are today with,
Yeah.
with your wife, your daughter, being with Crete. Like it's really like when you really put it into kind of like the words and you kind of describe like not like in a sales interview, right? Because then you're kind of pitching yourself. But when you're talking about
Yeah.
it like this in like a friend format, right? You can really like feel the story and the history
Yeah.
behind like the last 10 or 15 years of your life. Now you're newer to like the sales side. You just said like you've always been in operations for the most part up until FreightVana, but you've had a really diverse career. I mean, you've worked at JB Hunt, you've worked at Knight Swift, now FreightVana and Crete. Can you share how some of those experience have like maybe shaped your approach to not just sales but also like leadership?
Yeah. I mean, each company has their identity, right?
Yeah,
And to some extent, each identity is based off what success looks like, and success
absolutely.
can be widely different. It can be, narrowly different, But I will say, to your point, one of the reasons why I made the jump from Interstate Heartland at the time to Knight Swift was actually in conversation with that team because historically they've had the general manager role there, which is going to be a pricing and network design kind of role that works with the terminals, the leadership teams, and kind of brings people together about the intentionality behind our network design. That's kind of like the general gist, and that might be a little bit an oversimplification, but
Yeah.
for the time purposes, that's what it is. And one of the things they actually mentioned when I was interviewing for the role was they were actually excited to possibly bring someone in from outside the org for one of the first few times to kind of like refresh some ideas, like get some
Yeah.
curiosity in there. And that was kind of like what started the whole thing for me. And it's exactly why we started FreightVana too on the tail end, is just because we brought along a lot of talented leaders from that team, and those talented leaders were not all under the same impression of what their thoughts were on how a company was successful, but they were strategically brought together because they complement each other in that thought design. So when you're talking about like from company to company, it matters to me a lot, because when I was going from small, nimble, dynamic startup after being in, two larger corporations, one of the first questions I was actually asked was like, hey, now that you've had that flexibility on the agility side, like, are you sure you want to go back to the larger in motion kind of side, and that's actually a lot of the feedback I got from my peers and friends in the industry too. They were like, hey, you started that company because you were trying to build your own, and now you're going back to a company that might be not too dissimilar from where you came from. But I found out that was far from the truth. When I showed up on the Crete side, for a company that's been around for so long and has such a reputable reputation from its customer base and support, even in a market like this, I saw they were always open to ideas, right? They're not going to be your first movers all the time on things, and they self-admitted that, right? But they also are committed to two things: implementing successful strategies and also being the best trucking company in America, right? They want it, that's all they have in mind. They don't want to pretend to be something else. They don't tell their customers to pretend to be something else. And it's really been a different sell when, selling some stuff back and forth. It's been an adjustment for me, to say the least. So.
Why don't we dive into that a little bit? Who and what is Crete Carrier? How many? You guys are an asset-based carrier, is that correct?
Yep, 100% asset based, actually. So, and we're we're an amalgamation of a couple acquisitions, not necessarily part of their strategy moving forward, obviously. But when you think about it, they have Shaffer Trucking, Crete Carrier, and Hunt Transport are our three brands that we talk about in our sales side. And from that being said, we have 5,500 trucks, which is pretty awesome. We've had incredible growth in our dedicated side. We have about 1,200 trucks on our reefer, and if you think about the 5,500, right, that's going to be a very substantial portion of our fleet on the dry van side. But that's it. They're a company that knows who they want to be back to that point, right? They want to be a trucking company. They want to keep investing in the over-the-road side, our regional and our dedicated, and they don't have an identity crisis. Not saying that some others do, but they at least have their identity figured out, which is a very confident thing to like sell into.
So as a West region sales manager, what does your typical day-to-day look like, right? I mean, when you hear the word West region, you're selling out West, but what does a sales manager do for a corporation like Crete?
That's actually a great question too, because it's actually a little bit more dynamic than you'd think about in terms of like typical sales roles. We have obviously a very great pricing team in network design in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they do an incredible job at figuring out what works, what doesn't work in the sales process, which also helps refine what you're offering to customers. But what it looks like for my day to day is I manage the Western 11 for Crete Carrier. And what that means is when opportunities come in for pricing, sales, whether it's my accounts or someone else from Crete Carrier to lead on that sales account, right? I'm responsible for, making sure our pricing is in line with what we need. The network design is what we want to do. And then from there, we basically, one team, one dream, put that back to the customer. I mean, typically in the past, a sales role might be that like, hey, I'm going to get an opportunity. I'm going to bring it to my team. Pricing is going to decide what goes on to it. And to some extent, that is still exists at Crete, obviously. That's why we have our pricing team, but it gives you a little flexibility because they want us as the regional sales managers to know, hey, what is the rate? What is the service we need? What is a great fit, right? They look for that feedback and conversation, which is something that in the past we had always tried to silo away from the situation, and I think maybe because people didn't have the checks and balances set up to allow that to be functional, but it's very functional and it's executed very well. It's been something that I've actually thrived in because of the previous roles in pricing and network design, that actually got me excited about the role, right? To have some level of control into what you're doing and making the right decisions and allow a little bit of creativity. Ultimately, you'll have to answer for if your creativity is not going to be in line with success. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You had mentioned regional and dedicated. I want to talk about that a little bit, especially for the people who are mostly brokerage folks who may not know what that terminology even means. Can you break down regional and dedicated? Do you guys handle any spot freight as well?
You know, three great points there. I'll start with the regional side of things. Obviously, driver retention is a hot topic on the asset side of the industry, as well with
Yeah.
smaller and larger fleets too. But sometimes in this market, some drivers do gravitate to more national fleets just because of the availability of loads. Whereas,
Absolutely. I see that
yeah,
conversation all the time on Facebook, on
all
LinkedIn,
the
on
time,
Reddit. That they're always
right?
trying to go to the bigger carriers who have more regional dedicated stuff, so that they don't, they're not spending as much downtime, or they're having guaranteed home time, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And when you kind of work through that, how we view our regional is it's a competitive advantage to our team. The regional side is going to be catering to a lot of our hiring needs that we need to get drivers to improve our retention.
Yeah.
We have industry leading retention of our drivers. When you think about how the average might be anywhere from like 80 to 90, depending on the market, right, you're in on turnover for drivers, we
Yeah.
always pride ourselves in operating in the 40s to less. It's really substantially a big improvement for us. And how do we do that? The regional opportunities, and I mentioned the pricing design, network design. We are very disciplined in our approach to opportunities. And
Yeah.
that those fleets specifically fall into that bucket. We know what the rates are, we know how we operate, and how that works. When you talked about dedicated, it's something that we're very proud of. It's a growing side of our company, and those drivers are completely dedicated, as you would think, to the customers and
Mm.
opportunities associated. We have with like Costco, Target, Walmart, Kimberly Clark, you name it, right? Customers across the
Yeah.
board that you'd be thinking of, and it's an area we're still investing in with the company as well. Or over the road, I always want to remind customers is something that's been kind of viewed as like, hey, not maybe the best long-term investment by opinions people, because as regional
Yeah.
distribution centers pop up, the length of haul is getting shorter and shorter, right? But there is a ton of need for our over-the-road drivers in the 500 to 1,000 length of haul loads plus that we are continuing to invest in because we feel that we do very well at that.
Yeah.
Customers appreciate that we still have that, right? And it's a big side of our company that we're pretty stoked about.
I love that. And then I wanted to ask you, so you had mentioned driver attention we don't talk about it as much so much on the broker side, but is driver attention an important thing for shippers? Like when they've got a guy who knows what they're doing, who's coming in to load, or they know the operation, is that important for them as well?
Absolutely. Like the customers, I don't think understand because, as complicated as things have gotten in regards to like tracking, ELD, situations in
Yeah.
service right now, especially in this market where customers have KPIs at all-time highs in costs. I wouldn't say at all-time lows, but very competitive to the market right now versus where they have been. Because I think if you kind of take a step back on the 5-year plan, we're actually still in pretty competitive rates.
Yeah.
In regards to that. But the customers' churn isn't necessarily just the carriers. It's the drivers that they may not know are still running the freight. I mean, to your
Yeah.
point, when we were at FreightVana, one of the things they did really well was, hey, they talked about the drivers running the loads, right?
Mm.
They wanted their customers to know, basically, the cost of churn is not only FreightVana, it's the
Yeah.
carriers and drivers running the loads. So I think shippers do care about it. They obviously have a responsibility to still make sure that the supplier next up is going to execute well, right? But I do think our turnover is definitely a selling point for our team because of that. We're in a lot of the retail space, the CPG space,
Yeah.
and what that means is we're dealing with a lot of end customers for their customers. And
Yeah.
so when we can deliver the same drivers for them, delivering the same loads, and we get the consistency, everybody's happy, which is obviously a point we'd love to sell on.
Well, in to that point, there's a lot of fraud in those spaces as well, right? So when they can know, hey, we've got this, we know exactly who's coming in every single time, or we know these, 50 drivers or whoever it's going to be are going to be coming in. It kind of alleviates that pressure point of, okay, we don't have to worry about fraud from that perspective or theft from that angle, as much as we do on like a brokered load, or on sitting on the rail, or things going missing on an LTL shipment. It kind of makes it a little bit easier when they know, hey, this is a dedicated load. We know the drivers who are coming in; they're coming in here all the time. We're not going to have as many issues as well.
Yeah, I mean, fraud is such a uh, important task for our industry, mainly because transportation is more often than not a cost center, right? Like that's kind of how it's viewed. And right, wrong, or indifferent, we got to deal with that as a commodity in the purchase of that situation, right?
Yep.
But a lot of customers have asked us, and a lot of our newer customers that we've gotten close to have brought that up, specifically because I mentioned the identity of, hey, we're a trucking company, we're 100% asset based, right? We don't have drivers that aren't going to be company employed picking these loads up, right? We're really, really proud of that. It does come with its own cons sometimes, not necessarily that are unexpected, but if we get in a market buying, sometimes maybe a customer slows down from one direction or the other, we got to play catch up a little bit, but customers tend to treat us very fairly when that comes up, just as long as it's not a consistent problem, because they get it. Things happen in transportation, but they also have a job to do. But it's one of the things recently, to your point, fraud has been very, very, very hot topic for us in regards to we're seeing a lot of changes in contracts where people are talking about no brokering loads, right? And then I remind them, I'm like, but we can't, right? We have no authority, and they're like, no, but we're going to write this down, and that's just going to make sure, and they care about it. I think some of the battle of cost savings has increased fraud for a lot of reasons. Sometimes I think people get a little desperate in situations, but fraud's been prevalent in whatever side of the market. I think that people, definitely have seen an increase, but they don't understand that even in the peaks, fraud's still going strong. Like it's just kind of tough to deal with.
What kind of challenges, being an asset-based carrier, 100% asset-based carrier, do you guys have selling to shippers, especially in this kind of down market, right? There's a lot of competition on the broker side and on the asset side. So how do you guys kind of weather some of those challenges as the market, dynamically shifts?
We're a private company, which gives us a lot of flexibility in that conversation. We have This is going to sound like everyone says this, I'm sure, right? But we have a lot of great relationships with our customers, right? That we have been very transparent when the market's high or the market's low, that we have a fixed cost that we're competing against, and they appreciate the service that we provide. You can see across the board. I'll just give Crete a little toot of the horn here. We're carrier of the year for a lot of the shippers you see in the market, right? And that's because we show up consistently in what other side of the market is. We help them out when it's needed, and in return, they give us a lot of pressure relief when things get tight like it is right now. So selling into that is actually harder than you think sometimes. Just the other day, if we think about this out loud, in the Western 11, I had 8 available trucks on Monday. Right.
Wow.
And so when you think about when that stat, when it comes out loud and you're like, oh, how am I going to bring on a new customer? It really is going to be about our growth organically, our job creation, our hiring, so that would be part of the challenges that I'd say we face, is that, like, hey, there are areas in the country where we need more freight than others, where maybe we land more trucks than we do out west. But at the same time, the challenge for us on the sales side is making sure we put in the right long-term relationships into the system for our drivers, that we're not going to be churning out the next year, because drivers don't like churn on the freight either, right? When you think about turnover, right? They want to go to the same places. Not only do the customers want the same drivers, but the drivers want to go to the same places. They want to understand where they're going, so they're not surprised by receiving issues or hours or whatever. It's just as important.
No, for sure. I want to ask, what kind of trends are you seeing that are maybe shaping kind of how the industry is going to going into 25, especially into, in the West region where you're primarily selling into? Are there any specific market dynamics or customer demands that you're kind of keeping an eye on?
The stuff that I've seen a lot coming to plate right now is a lot of customers that are really impacted by the ports. That seems pretty obvious out west, right? But I think through COVID, we saw a good spread of transportation being moved to other ports and terminals across the country. Historically, that might have been coming to Long Beach, Seattle, Oakland, you name it, right? Portland included. Can't forget them. But they had some pressure to send them elsewhere, to get them distributed, because there was congestion. There was, we saw like 40 ships at some point in time plus during COVID out west, and that was crazy. Like the last time I saw that was the longshoreman strike in the late 22010s and the teens over there when I was first a broker, and I was trying to figure out what that even meant. So
Right.
little did I know that was crazy. And the one thing I've noticed is as ships getting larger and larger, canals getting narrower and narrower, and water becoming an issue with those crossings, that we're starting to see some pressure back to the ports receiving tenders that they were previously when we weren't routing them to other ports. So for me, it's been a lot of those ports being an impact, but also the adverse impact of that is operating in California is really tough. So for me, the trends that we're seeing is the companies moving to Arizona, moving to Reno, moving outside of those things has caused some network shifts in trucking companies that maybe have been historically operating in the lanes that they typically would out west, but now have to change. How do I get more trucks into Reno? How do I get more trucks into Phoenix? You name it, kind of like how that goes. So the pressure I've had is between the ports, and as we grow out further west away from the mainland ports, that will always still be busy. No one's saying LA, California, Southern California, Northern California will ever be short on their freight supply, but it's putting undue pressure on some of the traditional backhauls to be more competitive than they used to be.
Mm. And that also puts obvious pressure on other methods too, rail, LTL, because then it's everyone's trying to get that downward pressure and trying to get some more dynamic pricing, and it's tough when volumes start to change like that.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, that kind of reminded me of one of the things I missed under topic, the spot pricing for Crete. It is something that we actually just view for our network design. Obviously, we're a trucking company, and we want to find opportunity to add to our bottom line. But historically, we've been a very committed carrier in the high 90s to low 90s right across the board, and that's generated a lot of positive feedback from our customers across the board, which has helped ease that pressure. But our spot is primarily used to try and get our trucks in the right places. That's how we view it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Try to minimize the spot as much as possible and just continuously run, as much customer freight as possible, unless you have to, rely on the spot market for a load here or there. Or like you said, you may have 8 trucks on a Monday where you may only have, 5 or 6 loads, and you may need to turn to the spot market to get someone into a different position, right?
Yeah, and doing the right thing and when the market gets tight too, it is just as important.
Yeah. No, that's for sure, because we know the market's going to change, and you want to be reciprocal to your customers when they're giving you freight, when especially when the market is in the position it's in now. They could go anywhere and say, hey, let's take the lowest rate, but you may not be the lowest rate, but you may have the best, better service or better maintenance on your trucks or whatever it may be, and they just want to stick with kind of what they know, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Technology is something that's always talked about. This year it's been AI has been the massive talk in the industry. How is Crete maybe leveraging technology, and not necessarily AI, but just technology in general, to kind of improve operations and maybe ensure like a seamless, kind of communication between everyone who's involved, all the stakeholders?
That's a great question, because I kind of alluded to hey, how our implementation is on exploring new technologies and whatnot. I won't pretend to be at the top of the food chain there, knowing that what we're investing in across the board outside of the feedback I get. But the one thing I could tell you from a customer facing standpoint is that we've done a ton of investment into more or less to combat what are some of the questions in the market. You talked about fraud. You talked about customers expecting next day, free day delivery, right? So as a trucking company, how do you do that, right? It's just tons of points of data, so the investment that I can see Crete has been putting into the market is on how we get in front of people to give them as much trust that the load is moving in the direction at the right time as it should be, to their hands as much as possible. So we've included weather, we've included our trucks, our planning, because luckily on a 100% based asset company, you do have some proactive planning efficiencies that not many people have outside some manual tracking or the mobile tracking or whatever it might be, and so we've done a ton of investment in how we can make sure our customers know exactly where their truck is and where it's going to be and when. That's been most of our deployment on the back end of that.
Implementing weather is something that I don't see a lot of companies doing, but I think that there's more of a need for it, right? Like,
Hmm.
If I'm a shipper, I may not necessarily know, hey, my load coming from Baltimore, Maryland, what the weather's like on the route that they're taking, right? And what delays that weather may impose on that load, right? I'm sitting here
Yeah.
in Texas, and I may, I just know what the weather is like in Texas, unless I'm have friends or whatever. I'm trying to look at different areas, but like if I'm a shipper and I'm moving 500 loads, I'm not looking at the weather of every single location. So when you can implement something like that to maybe easily say, hey, if they look at this and say, hey, there's a weather delay, they can say, oh crap, like at least we know that this shipment is delayed because of the weather. The weather is becoming such a more prevalent issue all across the United States, from hurricanes, tornadoes, snowstorms. It's getting massively insane. So having those alerts, I think, is pretty unique.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about, like, let's just use Crete as a specific example when thinking about
Yeah.
that, right? I mentioned earlier about how things have started to get more regionally, distributed amongst, because I want my wife's batteries in her car remote died yesterday and she couldn't start it, right? So I was like, but I want those batteries tonight, right?
Yep.
And there's ways to make that happen. It starts with the first mile, middle mile, and then it goes to the final mile, obviously. But that first and middle mile are really important, because as they've gotten more regional, let's just think about the hurricanes that have happened in the Southeast. Like, that
Yeah.
was incredibly tragic, by the way. Like
Yes.
my wife's mom is out in the northern part of North Carolina that really did not do well, and so
Yeah.
that was really scary. But I have a lot of friends in the Southeast down there that I was checking on. It seems that most people that I know, at least, have started to work through the issues in front of them, but it's a
Yeah.
long way to go for them.
Absolutely.
But that, as an example, hey, we have a ton of trucks domiciled in the Southeast as a company. We have a ton of trucks domiciled in Texas for our company, right? And when those trucks don't flow from the Southeast to Texas or the Midwest, right? Where are those trucks that were supposed to be flowing from the Midwest and Texas to the West, right?
Yep.
Like, it's just a downward spiral, and if you're not communicating that, it's something that you're missing on, because it can really impact how customers view your relative planning to success, right? How proactive are you, right?
Yeah.
And customers don't want anything that's not the truth, of what's going on, even if it's like hard to deliver. We're very proud of our principles at Crete, and that one of them is just do the right thing. And we view doing the right thing as just being as proactive and transparent and blunt as possible, right? When we do have issues like that, because yeah, that's exactly what happened for a brief period. We had some problems in Arizona capacity wise, and customers still weren't happy. But
Yeah.
we had to deal with it, and we had some data on the back end to try to help with it, and we got through it, and we're doing well again. It was just really tough for us as it kind of impacted our network across the board.
Absolutely. Those kind of weather events, like you said, they're just a spiral event that kind of it impacts the entire network from end to end when those kind of things happen, because like you said, when you have the Southeast completely, maybe offline for 3 to 5 days, and those trucks are going to the Midwest, and then those trucks are supposed to then go from the Midwest, or the freight's supposed to go from the Midwest to the West. It messes up the whole supply line of those trucks and that freight
Yeah.
getting out into that network. So yeah, it's just, you kind of have to be diligent in making sure you're staying ahead and being prevalent with your planning, like you said, and also just making sure you're adapting to those new technologies and making sure that you're looking forward to say, hey, like, these are the kind of things that do impact, and this is how we can kind of make those a little bit easier for our customers to understand.
Yeah, you got to be a good trucker, right?
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line of being in this industry. It's easy to, what's that famous phrase? Rising tides raise all the ships.
Yeah.
Someone on there is gonna tell me what the actual quote is, so I'm looking forward to that. But it's when operators succeed in markets like this, is when they're a good long-term partner to have in your network. That's just how I view it.
As the industry continues to change and evolve as we know it does, are there any new technologies, and this isn't maybe on the Crete side, but more you personally, or technology or innovations that maybe you're excited about that could potentially impact Crete maybe in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I have that. existential crisis probably every other day, when I think about it. Not necessarily because, I'm necessarily thinking about it like that, but I always like to kind of keep myself abreast to it. When you think about the brokerage space specifically, and
Yeah.
how many carriers operate in that, right? And you ask like the person who's not in the industry, right? What can impact it the most? They'll never say it's the mom and pop carriers of the network. They won't lean
Right.
on that. They're not aware of it. Most people don't even know really how stuff gets A to B. They just kind of like, they just see it on the shelf and call it great.
Yep.
Um, but majority of North America's trucks, and all the brokers will appreciate this, is built off of the mom and pop shops, the
Yeah.
regional carriers and whatnot. And when you think about that, right, the thing that gets me most excited about is how the U.S. in itself can deploy those carriers in the most efficient way. I think one of the number one knocks I got when I was in the brokerage space was when people would try and sell people on things and why to use me as a broker versus other brokers, and a lot of stuff early on was really competitive. Hey, tracking, visibility, macro point. I still
Yeah.
remember macro point when you couldn't turn it off at some point in time, and drivers were not installing it. Back in like 2012, it was new to
Right.
us, and I was paying per trip, all sorts of stuff, crazy things. But I think the technologies that help them, right? Because they don't have the infrastructure either, right? You're
Yeah.
wearing one of my favorite companies up there, the Truck Parking Club,
Yep.
and I want to give them a shout out because that's a real issue that no one
It
talks about
is.
in the public, and it's a bad one that impacts, unfairly the smaller to larger trucking companies,
Yeah.
smaller to medium sized trucking companies because they don't have the infrastructure, the drop yards, the terminals across the network that can help them alleviate to some extent some of those pains. Obviously, we utilize truck parking publicly as well as a carrier, right? But we do have some access points that we have as part of our general enterprise infrastructure. So I love that one. I love that, people are going to talk about this one, but the ELDs, as we've moved closer to finding out how to successfully deploy those, I think those have been great, right? To
Yeah.
some extent, right? I think they've helped truckers also plan better. They've helped customers understand, how you can transit a mile and what might impact it. Because, I've had multiple customers across the board say, well, I have other trucking companies that can do this length of haul in this time period, and each trucking company, to some extent, should be able to do a certain length of haul, but some might be able to do more than others, right? And it's not that they're
Yeah.
doing anything illegal; it's just that the way they operate. So I think the fact that we can connect these small and medium shippers across, whatever optimized network that be, I just root for them. I miss my conversations sometimes when I was on the operating side of the brokerage side with my 5, 10, 20 truck fleet owners that I would talk to on the
Yeah.
day because they're living that life, they're making decisions, and they're building relationships on their own. And it's something I admire the heck out of.
Absolutely. Absolutely, man. Those operations are, I have so many friends that, like, from my broker days that are still 5 to 9 to 15 truck,
Yeah.
owners, and they're just out there grinding every day, man. They're in the hustle, trying to grow their fleets, trying to grow their customer base, trying to, maximize everything they can, and trying to, grow as big as they want to, right? And I think that's what's great about this industry, right? You can grow to as big or as little as you want to, just based on your determination and your drive and desire to win.
Yeah, that's the success behind that. The American dream. Can people talk about across the board? But trucking keeps America moving. I'll say it. I'm
Yeah.
biased. I'm in the industry. They were. One thing I will say is, when we went from COVID to now, I don't think truckers got less appreciated, right? Because back then it was, truck drivers, the first responders, the medical
Yep.
providers, right? Hey, we were talking about that as very important people, and I'm going to be a core proponent of supporting people that truck drivers, still need to be treated better, right across
Yeah.
the industry. They still need to be. I see it daily. Truck drivers posting signs about some of the wildest things at shippers and receivers. That I'm sure are based off of the wildest stories you've ever heard. Right. That
Yep.
they don't just make policies up for some reason. But at the same time, like it's just unfair. They do these hard jobs. They're away from their families. They're right now I think pay is increasing for them, but it's still not as good as the job entails because these guys work so many hours a week as well that like it's just something that needs to be improved upon, man. I have so much respect for them. Both my sisters actually work in trucking as well. I didn't touch base on that one. I touched base on one of them, but my
Yeah.
oldest sister's also at JB Hunt,
That's
and they
cool.
care so much about the drivers. That's one of the reasons my sister Nicole was so successful in her job at JB Hunt was because she was in charge of several dedicated accounts, and the drivers loved her. They'd be going from dedicated account to the next dedicated account because they wanted to work with her. My
Yeah.
sister Dawn's in charge of the driver experience side on the Southwest for the final mile, and she has nothing but joy in her day to day because she's working with the drivers she works with.
That's
And that's
great.
something I respect that people commit to doing. And on the sales side, all I can commit to doing is just finding the freight that the drivers want to haul, and they'll stay with Crete.
Speaking on that, kind of looking ahead, what are kind of some of your goals for the West region, and how do you see Crete kind of continuing to adapt and grow for the next few years?
Yeah, if you look at the map where Crete's at in the West, it's not going to be in California. It's not Oregon. It's not Seattle. We're in
Yeah.
Phoenix, Salt Lake, in the Denver market, Cheyenne and Denver. Okay.
Mm.
And we service the West from those destinations. We have drop yards in the various states I've mentioned previously,
Yeah.
that we work and go through. But our growth primarily is going to be historically in the past, we've gone in and out of the market, right, as a carrier.
Yeah.
And that's been viewed as success. But I mentioned also on the first part of this is, they went to me and the team and they want to grow the West, right? They're not looking at like, what we've done is successful, so let's keep doing it, right?
Right.
They want to get creative on that. And, we've historically been like, hey, why are we sending trucks to Salt Lake, Denver, Reno, P&W for us, right? It's not necessarily, on paper a path to success, but we've grown a ton of partnerships in those markets specifically that have allowed us to keep our miles up and our opportunities with good productivity for our drivers, per se.
Yeah.
But those are the areas of growth for us, is that we're looking to find out how we can be a regional player more successfully out West, because that's what's needed. The bell
Yeah.
to ring, it was always Southern California. We still want to ring it, but we got to find ways to do it from those markets because our inbound is going to come from where we're domiciled, and we're heavily domiciled, like I mentioned, in Texas and Georgia and Southeast. So when you think about that, we kind of have to selfishly keep our trucks out West a little bit, and make sure they're doing the right things. We don't want to do it at the sacrifice of success, obviously, but we're doing really, really good right now. I mean, you talk about landing 100 trucks, 150 trucks in a day. Now we're talking about 200 to 300, right? And it's been really awesome to see the customers who support us in that mission.
We started off this podcast by talking about your background and your time in logistics, and you've been in the industry for a long time. So as we wrap, I want to kind of finish kind of talking about that same thing. For those out there maybe considering a career in sales, career in logistics, brokers who maybe want to make the switch from the brokerage side to the asset side, or maybe even vice versa, maybe what kind of advice could you give for those people to help them succeed and have a long career in logistics like you have?
Yeah, one of my favorite shows I ever watched was Ted Lasso, and one of like the scenes that always brings a warm, fuzzy feeling to my stomach is the scene where he's playing darts with the owner from the owner's ex-husband, and he's talking about, basically he kind of sandbagged him, right, to beat him.
Right.
He didn't realize who he was playing. And I would tell the people out there, the lesson from that scene is what he said. You got to be curious. In the industry that might come off as shallow in terms of like opportunity for growth, right? Is actually quite extensive and expansive when you think about like how it webs and flows through the world, right? I mean, even in the customer relationships on the sales side, you make a good relationship with a transportation manager or someone in supply chain, and you do a good job for them, and they go somewhere else, it's pretty easy if you have a good fit there to start talking to them and figure that out,
Yep.
But that goes back to just making those relationships there and asking curious questions. Because when someone's starting out in the industry and they're not sure what they want to do on the brokerage or asset or billing or sales side or whatever they're looking at, right? Their next available opportunity is really as big as they make it out to be. I don't want to sound so deep on that, but like if I wasn't curious about diving into something new, I would have never ever been a part of where I'm at right now. Like I said, I went to school for history and teaching, and I started check calling drivers. And so then after that, I wanted to manage a small fleet. So I went to dedicated, right? But I felt like an imposter there. I feel like I've done an imposter syndrome everywhere I've been, and I've talked to a lot of people about that. And, there is some validity to fake it till you make it, but the part of that whole phrase is you got to make it. You can't just be faking it the whole time. And I always find myself in a situation where I have to learn rapidly because of my curiosity, and it's rewarded me tremendously. So if you aren't asking questions or exploring something at your own company to what's next, right? Sometimes you can get a little defeated and you can feel like you're stagnant, and there's nothing that deflates your own growth mindset than a little bit of heavy weight of a blanket of being stagnant. I get a little self-conscious sometimes that maybe I have gone to a couple too many companies. When you think about it, every 3 or 4 years, I've told myself it's been for whatever reason has happened. But I actually just want to remind people that like every time I've landed at a new company, it's not because I was trying to run from something. I was not trying to run from anything bad, anything great. Matter of fact, my current job was a referral from an old boss, right? That like just to put it in perspective of things, I was always trying to run to something I wanted to do, to something I felt invested in. And I would challenge anybody that when you're sitting there and you're looking in the mirror and you're asking for opportunities, just make sure you're pushing yourself as hard as you want to be, because my wife always jokes with me. She always tells me, if you want something bad enough, you'll make it happen. And I'm a firm believer in you work hard to get what you earn, not what you think you're supposed to deserve.
Jesse, I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the show today, sharing some of your insights from your awesome career in logistics. If the audience wants to get in touch, they want to learn a little bit more, or they just want to chat about freight with you, how can they find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very prevalent there. It's something that I encourage people to jump onto more. It's something that I didn't take into consideration outside before I joined the sales side of things, but I've actually found the most reward from it is connecting with other people in the industry. And I really encourage people, if they have more questions, to reach out to me to ask about it. I'm here to help. And I would prefer that. If I could live a life fulfilled by helping people, it would make me a happy person. So
I love that. I'll make sure to have Jesse's links in the comments if you guys want to connect. He's a great follow on LinkedIn. It's also how Jesse and I connected. If you guys like today's podcast, make sure you give it a like and review. It does help us out a ton. And we do drop 3 weekly newsletters at thinkfreight.io Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We'll catch you guys in the next episode. And don't forget to think freight.